Welcome to the Catholic Economics Podcast. Sorry I'm a little bit late this week. My wife got really bad poison ivy, and so I've kind of had to be doing everything around the house on top of normal work. But here I am, and today I want to talk about a couple things with the general economy, and then I want to hit energy stuff to a good extent. So the first thing on the general economy, this AEI article. So AEI, if you've never heard of it, it's kind of I guess I would call it a right liberal type of think tank, and they have a decent amount of influence, I would say, with the Republican Party. For the most part, they've done a service, I think, to an extent, to people who were canceled in academia before being canceled in academia was really much of a thing, before it was as commonplace as it is now. And so the one I can think of is Charles Murray, who definitely wouldn't be at home in something like a George W. Bush presidency or something like that. George W. Bush would have been to the left of Charles Murray if you've never read Charles Murray's stuff, and he's got really good books. I would recommend picking up his latest book. I haven't read his latest book, but I read the one before it. So check him out if the title grabs you when you look at his stuff. But AEI in general, their stuff is, tariffs are bad, taxes are bad, and spending is bad. That kind of idea. And it's not everything. That's not the only thing they talk about. They talk about all kinds of stuff. But in terms of just sort of the pure economics, that's really where they're at. They don't like subsidies in general, so they've got stuff on ag subsidies. They're very in line with stuff about the Constitution and that kind of thing. And so this article from July 19th by Desmond Lockman, "The Economic Consequences of a Second Trump Term," I thought it's an interesting read, and it's very short. But basically he makes 2 points. Number one, he's really concerned about taxes and spending. So going back to Trump's first term, obviously, cut out 2020 because you can't really gauge, I think, economic policy in an environment like that. And even in a recessionary environment, things are going to be weird. But if you just look at it, the kind of non-recessionary years, so 17, 18, 19, and you see Trump with the whole populist thing that a lot of these type of guys like AEI don't like, which is lots of spending and tax cuts. And so what AEI type of guys are really worried about at the end of the day is debt. They're worried about the national debt. And so he's trying to give this preview of Trump, and he's like, "Hey, Trump is gonna be, it was gonna reimpose or reimplement his tax cuts that are set to expire pretty soon, and this guy thinks he's gonna blow out the budget." Well, I think if you look at the numbers, Trump didn't exactly blow out the budget until 2020. So again, if you look at the normal years, it wasn't as though we got a massive ramp up in spending. It was that we got lower taxes. And again, there's a vein of guys like Desmond Lockman at AEI that would say that, look, you just grow your way out of a tax cut. So you don't worry too much about the national debt. You just, if you can, reduce the spending, but reduce taxes, because reducing taxes is going to be good for investment and blah, 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 that sort of thing. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But I think it's interesting to see where these guys are at, and almost that they're so scared of this debt thing at this point because of where the debt is, that it's almost like they don't even want their tax cuts anymore because they're so paranoid about the debt. And the way I think about debt, and this really comes to me from something that one of my finance professors in my undergrad said to me, and it's always stuck in my head. He's like, well, what are the U.S. is this global superpower, right? What are the other countries going to do? To the extent that the U.S. debt is held by other countries, what happens if the U.S. doesn't want to pay? Like, are we going to get attacked? So on some level, I guess this is what the MMT people will say is that, well, government debt doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, you just blow everybody up, which is kind of insane. But the other side of it is that, there's other schools of thought on this, that somebody's going to have debt. The global empire is going to have debt. They're going to have a lot of debt. And that's just the way it's going to be. And, if you think about it, you break down the spending, really, we wouldn't have to worry about so much about the stupid debt if we didn't have this global empire to finance. As in, if we spent the same on our military that that Europe spent on theirs, or that Canada spent on theirs, we wouldn't have these problems. And so, or something very close to that. So it's, at that point it becomes, okay, well, maybe that's a return on investment then. Maybe there's an idea of there's always going to be a superpower, right? And so this always gets into kind of international relations or, foreign affairs or international policy, whatever you want to call it. But this is something that I tell my students a lot, is that macroeconomics is sort of a subset of international relations, because the two are always going to meet in some way. And maybe that's not fair to macro to say it's a subset, but at the very least, there are considerations from the political and I guess foreign relations side of things that have to be accounted for in any kind of macroeconomics that is going to be practical or useful. So of course, you could just have your GDP model and blah blah blah, but if you really want to think realistically about how things ought to go, then you have to include this kind of thing in there, the military and what's the value of that and all that sort of thing. So that really brings me to the next point that Lockman makes in here, and he's talking about tariffs. And so he's got a couple of links to, let's see here. So Trump has indicated that if elected, he will impose a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports. At the same time, he will impose a 10% across-the-board tariff on imports from all other countries. Well, why not? What is the problem with that? Of course, if you operate on the theory that AEI operates on, that all tariffs are bad, there's no such thing as a good tariff, and completely ignoring the fact that the United States used to, before the income tax, used to fund itself at the federal government through tariffs. You look at the work of some other economists, like Frederick List, for instance, or I can't remember his name, but he's from South Korea, and he has a book called Bad Samaritans and Kicking Away the Ladder. I can't remember his name right now, but he's an economist who is very much of the idea that development requires tariff. Development requires protection. And you look at the history of England in the 1800s and 1700s. And what did they do? They protected their fledgling industries that at the time were very, very small and very decentralized, but then became the factories and things like that we see. And you can think about other developing countries being the same way, and you can also think about the U.S. in this way. So the thing about the mentality that tariffs are always bad is that it operates on the assumption that people are only consumers. The math that gets you to tariffs are always bad only operates on thinking about the U.S. populace as consumers. And so it presumes almost that we have to have everything produced for us other places. And so it's almost like it assumes its own conclusion in a way. The conclusion being, we shouldn't make anything and we should just buy it from everybody else. And so a tariff is only a bad thing in that sense. But the bottom line is we have to make things ourselves. And again, this is where the international relations part comes in. If everybody's your friend all over the world, if everybody's our buddy, everybody has the same set of interests that we do, there's never going to be a conflict. There's never going to, or at least at the very least, I guess being a little more charitable, the risk of that conflict is very, very, very low. There's not going to be any kind of conflict that we have to worry about. And there's not going to be a situation in which there's something we need that we've got to have from someone else that we can't make ourselves. And you can see that we've gotten ourselves into this position. I remember there being chip companies in my hometown as a kid, and now they've been gone for a long time. And you can see the Biden administration just desperately trying to rejuvenate this chip thing after the COVID explosion, right? And so, but I think the reality of it is it doesn't take something as extreme as COVID and the policy regime around it is really what I'm referring to. It doesn't take that kind of lockdown and disruption to tell you that there's a risk of not doing anything yourself, of hiring everything out to everyone else. And so, and especially if you're talking about someone who is an adversary and they're still sending things to you, okay, well, maybe they're just keeping you on the hook, right? Maybe this is a fishing analogy that they know they have some kind of power over you because they send you everything you need. And so you put that tariff in place and all of a sudden the calculus becomes different. Hey, maybe we can manufacture things here. Maybe people who, for whatever reason, couldn't hack a more academic, managerial type of job can do just fine going to a factory every day and pushing a button. And they can make a decent living. They can have a family. They can support a family on that. That's the way things ought to be. We got to meet people where they're at, as not only as consumers, but as producers. So anyway, a little piece from AEI, and of course always my kind of, at least my stock answer to this kind of thing. And I think the stock answer you get from a lot of people these days. But the next thing on the general economy is GDP Now. So there's going to be another GDP Now tomorrow. But I wanted to get this out given the delay. So we're getting pretty close. So we're still going to have another update to the estimate tomorrow, but I think we're getting pretty close to when we're going to have the actual data on the second quarter. So this is a forecast or a nowcast, whatever you want to call it, of the second quarter quarterly GDP growth on an annual basis. And it's actually ticked up to 2.7% as of July 17th forecast. And they were talking about so this is up from where it was. It was down at 2% fairly recently. And so they were talking about U.S. Census Bureau housing starts report and industrial production from Federal Reserve Board of Governors. And the Board of Governors thing is interesting stuff. It's kind of fun to read that sometimes because the respondents will give kind of short answers or short paragraphs of things that they're seeing. And sometimes it's interesting to read that stuff. But both of those numbers, the housing starts and the industrial numbers, both pushed up a little bit. The industrial numbers came up quite a bit, actually. And that's what drove their forecast to go up from 2.5% on the 16th to 2.7% on the 17th. So we'll see where they go. And the range in the last month and a half, 2 months here, has been between, say, 1.5% to 3% growth for the second quarter. And so we're kind of getting close to the top of that range at 2.7. The housing starts number, man, it is so hard to believe that. I know construction stocks have been doing well and all that stuff, but I just can't see it. The stuff we talked about last week with price cuts and things like that with the houses are actually on the market. And so housing starts, so people building new houses, unless that's just a completely different market with its own fundamentals, this has got to be delayed data or something like that. So I just don't see it really being a good indicator of what we're going to see the rest of this year at the very least. And of course, this is always kind of backward looking, right? Because what we're looking at is April, May, June in terms of the second quarter GDP forecast. So fair enough. If, in the second quarter of this year, we had decent growth in housing starts, but I just don't think that that's going to continue for the rest of the year. And of course, I'm not a macro guy. I've always said that. And I'm not a forecaster of any of these things, but to me, it doesn't seem like the consumer can really handle this. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was some energy stuff. And there's just a couple of articles that I thought were super interesting and indicating some of the, I think, absurdity of the whole energy transition that we're all told is always imminent, always right on the edge. We're right there. We just need a few trillion more in subsidies, right? And all of this stuff that's supposedly fabulously cheap and eco-friendly in some way or another is just it's going to sweep the world, and we're all going to be richer for it. I think it's idiotic, and nobody who's serious thinks that's still the case. So I've got a Robert Bryce article, and let me tell you, if you're interested in energy stuff and you have a Substack account, you need to sub to Robert Bryce. I get his stuff every day, and I think it's fantastic. He's always got the latest news, and he's always got a nice perspective on it. So recently there was a hurricane off the coast of, I believe, Nantucket, where they have a lot of these offshore wind turbines. And so the way to think about this is the Northeast does not have a lot of opportunities for these turbines on the land. Number one, it's very densely populated, but the terrain in the Northeast, even in areas that aren't densely populated, is just not suited to these kinds of things from an engineering perspective. And so what you're seeing, what we're getting is these offshore turbines. Well, suddenly we get a hurricane in that area, and of course, what was it, Hurricane Sandy up there a few years ago. I mean, we get bad hurricanes in the Northeast now and then. And if you think about this, these are, and the offshore turbines are much larger than the onshore ones. The onshore ones are big enough, but the offshore ones are just tremendously massive. And you're talking about an amount of fiberglass and wood and metals and things like that and plastics on these turbine blades. It's just tremendous. And you can read the story, but basically a bunch of this fiberglass and other material washed up on the shore of Nantucket. And I don't even think we really know the sort of wildlife impact of that. And of course the beach issues. Obviously people want to go to the beach, and I mean, back when I lived in Corpus Christi, we went to the beach a few times, and you'd have the little tar balls from the rigs, the oil rigs off the shore there. But it really wasn't a big deal to you as a beachgoer. Of course, we've all seen the Dawn dish soap commercials where, the poor ducks and everything, which obviously is an issue. But 6 foot wide shards of fiberglass all over a beach. I'm a little concerned about that from a human safety perspective. Tar balls on the beach you can just kind of ignore, but you can't ignore. If you've done your own oil change one time in your life, you've probably had more oil on your hand than you will going to a beach with oil with oil rigs off the coast. But the amount of fiberglass and stuff that came off of these turbine blades is just tremendous, and it's just, we just don't know. And these things were put out there with no thought as to how damaging these things might be if they broke. Nobody really cared. They just said, put them out there because we have to, because otherwise the whole planet's going to blow up and disintegrate or whatever. It's just another thing. It's just another item on this long list of very clear, predictable costs of the so-called energy transition that just have been ignored. And it's totally ridiculous if you do any kind of, if you're going to do a cost benefit or an externality based analysis of this, well, it's a little bit dishonest if all you count are the negative externalities of oil and gas, petroleum type products, and the positive externalities, so-called, and ignore all the negative externalities of the generation types that are favored by the subsidy regime, which is wind and solar and batteries. So another piece of news, and this is from Just the News, which I think is a decent outlet. I believe I get their stuff in my inbox as well. And so the headline, U.S. oil and gas hit record production despite opposition from OPEC activists and the Biden administration. And I think that title right there distills a lot of the story that we've been told in the last few the last few years. And I think if you want to understand this in a kind of an Econ 101 framework, just close your eyes or get out your pen and paper and draw yourself a supply and demand graph. And then take that supply curve and shift it to the left. In other words, up. Push that upward sloping supply curve. Draw another supply curve above it. Okay. And then the demand curve that you started with, draw another demand curve above it or to the right of it. And I think that really tells the story. And what you should do is shift that demand curve farther up than you shift the supply curve. So what have these activists and the Biden administration done? And I really don't think it's OPEC that much. I think their influence is pretty small in this. What have they done? They have made it more and more expensive to extract, transport, and refine petroleum products in the United States and in other places. That's what the ESG policy regime, because ESG is not just an activist investor nonsense. It's a policy regime across the world, thanks to the UN and other NGOs. And so what you have is an increase in the cost of doing all those things, right? That's that supply curve shift to the left. An increase in the cost of those things. And at the same time, the sort of reopening and everybody rediscovering the beauty of travel or whatever, the continued development of middle-income countries and low-income countries. I could show you articles with the number of new coal plants in India and China over the last 10 years and the plans for them going out during the next 5 to 10 years. A tremendous demand for reliable energy. And reliable energy just so happens to come to us in the form of, oftentimes anyway, if it's going to be cheap, it comes to us in the form of thermal energy from petroleum. And that's just the way it is. And nuclear's fine, great, whatever. But it's the other stuff is just, we have lots of coal, we have lots of natural gas, we have lots of oil. It's difficult to see why you wouldn't make use of it, especially because putting up a coal-fired power plant is way cheaper than a nuclear facility. We can talk about dreams of cheaper nuclear in the future all we want, but the reality is it's expensive right now. So I guess the headline would be surprising to somebody in some sense. Wow, we hit a record production? But I thought, Joe back in 2019 tell us that he was going to end fossil fuel production? Well, the reality is they just couldn't come through on that. And I think you see it in the strategic midterm reserve, right? The draining of the strategic petroleum reserve. back in the midterms, back in 2022, and also more recently, continuing to drain it. And so on the one hand, you have the policy regime making things more expensive intentionally on purpose, right? That is the purpose. The purpose of this type of policy is to make the product more expensive. That is basic externality theory. There's a negative externality associated with something, so we got to make it more expensive to produce. That's the point. That's the purpose. The price needs to go up. Think about it as cigarettes, right? We put a tax on cigarettes because we don't want people to smoke. It's the same thing with oil. That's the way these people see oil and gas and coal. Okay? It's bad, we need to tax it. And whether they do that explicitly with a tax or whether they do it with a regulation that makes it more expensive and sort of indirectly increases the price of it, it's the same thing at the end of the day. So I think the reality of it is just this shows you how much people need this stuff, how much people need reliable, highly transportable, inexpensive energy. This is just the way it is. Their tagline on here from a CEO named Toby Rice, energy poverty for the first time in 20 years increased. That's a travesty. Exactly. But it's all sort of part and parcel, if I can use that phrase, of the Bidenflation. And I guess not to let his VP off the hook, because I think things would have been 10 times worse with her. I mean, her statements on this stuff were just awful. So the last one here, Ford will build Super Duty trucks in Canada in pivot from EV plan. So this is just absolutely comical to me, and again, such an indicator of the need for reliable transportation and really, if we're talking about the heavier trucks, production of things, right? Industry needs these types of machines. That's what we need them for. I drive an old 3/4 ton old F-250. I drive it, but it's 30 years old. But it can still pull quite a bit. It can still pull something heavy, and this pivot here that they were going to take this plant in Canada, and they were going to make EVs out of it. Ford was. They were going to produce EVs out of this plant. But now what they're going to do is they're going to dump $3 billion into churning out more F-250s, F-350s, F-450s, 550s, whatever they are, however big. And of course, those things are powered. What are they powered by? They're powered by 6.7 liter diesels and 7.3 liter gas engines. Huge engines, especially by today's standards, massive engines. And so again, this is just the reality of the situation. We can talk about EVs till we're blue in the face. We can talk about how wonderful they are or whatever. But at the end of the day, they're just not there. They are not capable of doing the work that needs to get done. And I'm sure people are happy with their hybrids, or maybe they're happy with their plug-in EVs or whatever. But the reality is, at the end of the day, they're too expensive. They are less useful, and they're just not fit for purpose. And so this is kind of an interesting thing. This puts the lie, I think, to this idea that, oh gosh, they're just so cheap and reliable and wonderful, and they're so inexpensive to work on, and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, if that was all true, then Ford would be making them in this plant. They wouldn't be dumping $3 billion into this plant to keep making the trucks that have been actually moving the world. So anyway, that's all I have for this week, and I plan to have everything back on schedule for the weekend, this coming weekend. Thanks for listening.